Good morning. I'm Joe Weirix. I'm the Public Diplomacy Fellow at GW's Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communications. Welcome. Welcome to this, the third in our webinar series, Handbook on Public Diplomacy webinar series. Today's is a very timely topic. Today's webinar is on the topic of public diplomacy, past, present, and future. Uh, I, I'll be moderating our Q&A towards the end of today's session. A reminder, the easiest way, best way for folks who've dialed in to join us this morning to send forward your questions is to enter them in the Q&A box, and then I'll read those out when we enter the Q&A period. Um, uh, but uh, but let me now pitch to the real mastermind behind this webinar series and the editor of the Handbook on Public Diplomacy, Sean Ade. Sean is uh, an associate professor at George Washington University's School of Media and Public Affairs, and also himself the former director at the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communications. So with that, over to you, Sean, to make our intros and to kick us off.
Great. Thanks, Joe. All right. Well, I'm really excited about today. Our guest is Mark Taplin. Mark has had a nearly 40-year foreign service career, split 50-50 between the U.S. Information Agency and the State Department. He joined USIA in 1980 when it was still under the Carter administration. He served in Moscow from 84 to 87 as assistant cultural attaché, where he helped organize concert tours by, among others, Vladimir Horowitz, David Brubeck, and Billy Joel, and where he had a front row seat for the dramatic changes under Glasnost and Perestroika. This was the first of two assignments he had in Russia. He also served as PAO in Kyiv from 1999 to 2001, then was State Department Director for Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus. He was Deputy Chief of Mission and Charge d'Affaires in both Bucharest and Paris. Of course, most importantly on his resume, he was, as Joe is now, an IPDGC Public Diplomacy Fellow from 2008 to 2010 when I was director. His final position at State before retirement was serving as ECA Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy, then the Principal at DAS, then Acting Secretary from 2015 to 2017. Most recently, he was a trustee at the American Councils for International Education from 2019 to 2025. So like I said, Mark and I worked together for a couple of years at IPDGC. We did a number of really interesting events back then, including, I think most exciting, the event we did on the 50th anniversary of the American exhibition in Moscow. And we brought back a bunch of guides who had been there at the time. And if anyone on this webinar is familiar with that event, it's famously known for the kitchen table debate or between Khrushchev and Nixon, but a lot more went on there. It was a really important public diplomacy moment in history. And Mark's chapter in our handbook not only talks about the ways in which over the course of his career he's seen public diplomacy become integrated, I should say, into diplomacy itself, so that it's really impossible to separate the two. But also the importance of public diplomacy throughout history. Mark is a wonderful author and thinker, and I guess I could say amateur historian, since you don't actually get paid to do it. But he wrote a wonderful book called Open Lands about Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union that I highly recommend. And so now Mark's going to talk for a few minutes about his chapter, and then we'll have a conversation between us, and then we'll go to your questions. So Mark, take it away.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Joe. It's a pleasure to be back in the mix with my old friends at GW. And by the way, I think the handbook is really extraordinary. And I highly recommend it. Maybe about a quarter of the way through it. So it's a testament to just how important GW's contributions have been to public diplomacy. And, Bruce Gregory, GW's own Bruce Gregory being, one of the leading lights. But this is now, a couple of decades worth of, serious scholarship and important work in public diplomacy. So I also want to thank you, Sean, by the way, for scheduling this on April Fools, because that gives me an element of plausible deniability here that I could be handy before the end of this show.
Hmm.
Um, and the topic itself, I mean, for an old guy like me, past, present, future, I can't wander off the reservation because you've given me, the entire reservation to work with.
No.
But let me say a few words about the chapter that I contributed to the book. Um, and yes, there's a little bit more of the, first person in it as a practitioner than would be the case with a lot of the other articles that have been contributed to the PD Handbook. Um, I was inspired in part over the years, actually, by the fact that when I came in 1980, public diplomacy was still being sort of treated as something kind of separate on the side. The old line foreign service people typically, sort of viewed this as something, hey, nice to do, but, over here. With actually, when I came in, it was still the U.S. International Communication Agency, renamed a little bit later on USIA. And, people like George Kennan, for instance, felt that it was better, like the British Council, let's keep these programs, this work over on the side. We professional diplomats will handle the real diplomacy, often behind closed doors. Um, as time went on, I first of all came to understand that actually it was kind of an anomaly in terms of statecraft and foreign policy, including in the U.S. experience. And also that as time went on, because of the changes in the world that we've seen, increasingly public diplomacy, it was right at the core. And so that's why I labeled the chapter diplomacy, comma, public, because public diplomacy is right at the core of diplomatic practice now, and I think always will be for a number of reasons. So diplomacy, comma, consular, commercial, multilateral, but certainly diplomacy, comma, public, it's part of the core. And it stands to reason because there's a whole global marketplace out there that's only expanded as, each year goes by, ideas, information, initiatives, and the government role within it has to be, increasingly targeted. There's no serious diplomatic effort that's going to be successful these days without engaging partners, engaging publics, building coalitions of the willing. You're not going to succeed with anything serious and ambitious if you're not including that element right up front in what you're doing. And those things, by the way, I haven't changed my mind about since January 20th, but we'll, perhaps get to that in the course of our discussion. So I did spend some time talking about historical elements that had interested me over the years. And, that includes the role of maybe our best public diplomat ever, Ben Franklin, and Tom Paine. These guys were intentional in what they were doing in terms of communicating and trying to influence foreign publics. There's a series of letters that I found in writing this piece between Franklin and a Welsh clergyman, where he talks very intentionally about the public diplomacy, without using that label, that he was doing and how he approached it, and how, for instance, striking while the iron was hot and striking repeatedly through the press, through pamphlets, through other means of communication, you can influence people's views in other places. And Tom Paine's impact, of course, was felt globally, and partly because of how articulate he was in terms of projecting this important narrative. We'd call it a strategic narrative about what the United States, this new United States, was about. And he has this great quote where he says, "An army of principles can penetrate where an army of soldiers cannot." John Adams, who despised Tom Paine personally, said afterwards, Washington's sword would not have been enough without the pen of Tom Paine. And so those guys understood the importance of this type of communication, of influencing people broadly to come to your side. Um, Throughout the 19th century, there are all kinds of examples of American diplomats who were uh, working the aisle that we would call now public diplomacy and doing so successfully and doing it in ways that we would recognize even today as being comparable to the kinds of things that American public diplomats are doing in the 21st century. And I have one particular favorite I'll just mention in passing, and that's somebody who's sort of forgotten, John Bigelow, a journalist who was sent to Paris at the outset of the Civil War, specifically to try to influence public opinion, and particularly to help convince the British and the French not to recognize the Confederacy officially, diplomatically. And he was incredibly successful. And he used all kinds of different tools and approaches that we would recognize as being important ones for success today. That included, making sure you were engaging people, making sure you were listening to people. Go to the editors that you think would be sympathetic. You know the French public is against slavery, so get the Emancipation Proclamation out there. Get the battlefield news out there. Find other ways of reaching people who are going to be your natural allies in the environment you're working in. And his efforts were probably the most successful propaganda efforts of the war, certainly on the American side. He even had something that he referred to as contingent funds, maybe a little bit akin to grant making, that he used strategically to get press placements and also to pay for information that he could then take out publicly, in one case, to stop the French effort of building ships for the Confederacy by revealing that to the French public. So throughout the 19th century, there was a lot of that kind of activity. But if we move into the 20th century and into the Cold War period, then we're, into a period that we have living memory of, for one thing. But secondly, that was public diplomacy done at this industrial scale. And I talk a little bit in the piece about some of my own involvement. When I was a 23-year-old in my first overseas assignment in Mauritius, and how the public diplomacy effort was driven centrally, but we had a whole array of tools, and these were offered to different places, and we could mix and match them to a great extent, what was useful for us. And there was a limited universe of information out there. So our products were, they sold themselves. VOA programs on reel-to-reel tapes, of magazines that were compendiums of some of the best and most interesting articles that were written in the US press, the wireless file producing information. And it almost didn't matter what we were offering in an environment like Mauritius. There was demand for it. It sold itself. Sean's already mentioned of some of the experiences I had in the former Soviet Union. Those were kind of classic moments in Cold War public diplomacy. And over time, I'm absolutely persuaded that these types of information programs and exchanges cumulatively, and it includes some of the things even the Soviet Union was doing in terms of sending performing arts groups to the United States, this changed the climate of the relationships and helped foster a logic of détente and cooperation and support for arms control that might not have existed otherwise. And I think that ultimately helped bring the Cold War to a swifter and probably calmer end than might have been the case otherwise. And then I move into sort of how do things look in the post-Cold War era and in the era that we at least have just gone through. And I think one of the things I felt from one tour to a second tour in Moscow was that what was in the toolbox that in a sense sold itself before, once we moved into the post-Cold War era, once the universe, that global marketplace, and that included with the advent of digital technology, the internet, ultimately social media, suddenly what we had to offer was either less competitive or simply drowned out in the overall competition of ideas and narratives that were out there. So things that in the 1990s that we produced were within a year or two in the former Soviet Union, uh, really not that attractive, not that interesting. Pamphlets, one example I cite, pamphlets, what is democracy? What is market economics? Well, for stakeholders in Washington, that sounded great. But for the actual experience in working with people on the ground, not terribly meaningful because people were already learning kiosk capitalism, taking the bus to Turkey. You didn't have that much to quote unquote teach people. Um, and we went through a series of challenges, and of course, with reduced budgets for a period of time up until 9/11, before people rediscovered the importance of proactively pushing our narratives, our story out in the rest of the world. And I think leave some of this open for discussion, but the title I used was The Battered Toolbox, because I think a lot of the tools that worked so successfully for us were less competitive, less relevant, less attractive for people. And in the vastly expanded global marketplace of ideas, including online, where does the State Department spokesperson fit in? Where does that official government declaration fit in? Not that clear. So I think my conclusions were in the chapter that, as I said before, I mean, any substantial foreign policy achievement, it's going to depend on building, maintaining coalitions of willing and like-minded people. And that has to be well beyond the sphere of governments. That's ad hoc alliances involving governments, NGOs, business associations, citizens, media of all types. And governments, to be successful, are going to have to demonstrate that their views are shared of elsewhere in the world in order to be competitive. So Franklin and Payne, they showed the importance of having a compelling narrative of, and the American example in that era was influential throughout the world. People like Bigelow understood listening, the importance of listening, engaging people in the local scene, and tailoring your message and working with your partners locally, that was a key to effective messaging. And finally, I'd say what you saw with our kind of industrial scale public diplomacy during the Cold War was that you need to have a long-term, consistent approach on many platforms, working with the same themes, the same values over time to really have a profound impact. And and obviously, like maybe a lot of others who are on this webinar, and I think this is a starting point for discussion potentially. Where are we today after January 20th? I mean, some of these assumptions, including assumptions that were part of what I wrote a year ago, are very much being called into question. And can you have a public diplomacy without having discernible positive narratives at play? And what about those tools again? Don't you need to have tools and resources to work effectively? So I mean, I'll keeping an eye on the clock here. I'll leave it there. Look forward to questions and comments, and without pretending that I have a lot of answers.
Great, that was wonderful. Yeah, I want to just start with maybe reality because what you've just described doesn't seem to look like the first 90 days of the Trump administration. And so in your book, you describe what public diplomacy has always been in practice and some of the tug of war and some of the great examples of it. But in your book, I'm sorry, in your chapter, you write public diplomacy is not marginal nor is it optional. And yet one could argue that this administration is treating it as if it's optional in many ways. The cutbacks in staff, the cutbacks in programs. You mentioned aid as one example, but so many others, international broadcasting especially. Um, and I'm wondering, just from an overview, as a former practitioner, what is your perspective on what public diplomacy will look like under this administration, based on what we've seen so far? What is it going to be in practice, or, can we even say that it's going to exist? I'm sure it's going to exist in some form, but what does that look like to you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I would even want to hazard a guess in terms of the basic question and pretending to have a crystal ball here. I think it's also it's important to make the observation that we're less than 90 days
Mhm.
into the new administration. So, having said that, and as someone who's living in Europe currently, I mean, first impressions, as we say, first impressions matter. And, you're setting a tone already that has raised a lot of questions and raised a lot of concerns. Um, I mean, I think, the question I asked, I mean, can you have public diplomacy, American public diplomacy, without having sort of a discernible, positive set of strategic narratives behind it? We haven't tried that before, that's for sure, because there is a sense that you're potentially abandoning soft power, the pillars that you had of being attractive to others, and so 6 months from now or a year from now, if somebody's, asks a foreign citizen of whatever country, what do you admire about America? I, you know, that should be a concern for the new administration for all the reasons that we've talked about already, that these elements have served the United States over the years well. These types of considerations, when they've been taken into consideration, have been important. And you really have to go back to the 19th century to find a period where we really were just moving ahead on the basis of our domestic narratives without essentially paying a lot of attention to what was going on elsewhere in the world or what the reaction was to our actions. Um, and so if we stay centered, if the new administration stays centered on domestic political communication, that's not going to be enough to be successful in the public diplomacy um, world. And a recent example might be the video, for instance, that was done and I think deployed around the time that the vice president visited Greenland last week. And that's a minute and a half video that on one level seems to be pitched towards Greenlanders and Americans, seeing that their interests are entwined, but it's also doesn't feel like it was really developed with an audience in Greenland or anywhere else in mind. It seems much more sort of domestically centered. We have to, if we want to be successful, we're going to have to listen to foreign audiences, uh, foreign opinion, and work those elements into our messaging, and not simply stay focused on the messaging that is intended to persuade fellow Americans that a new administration's policies are the right ones.
I can't personally think of any post-war administration in the United States that has been so, and this would include the first Trump term too, but this one on steroids, I think, that has been so um, blind, at least to the value of public diplomacy as we normally understand it, and of partnerships and alliances and that sort of thing. One thing that we have, of course, had in the United States during that period and during all periods is that we've had administrations that have come in to varying degrees of I guess hubris might be one way to look at it, I think, in some cases, but also just, thinking, okay, we're gonna make a mark here. This is who we are. And that can be a positive or a negative. I'm thinking of, anything from Reagan to Obama. I think both of those administrations came in with that kind of attitude, whether it was change domestically, but also about, the imprint in the world. But those administrations and every other administration seem to sort of understand public diplomacy at some level. I'm wondering, am I right about that, or are there examples in the post-war period? uh, Nothing like this exactly, but have you ever seen anything like this in terms of, kind of a just obvious hostility towards the idea of international broadcasting and aid and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that every administration, and this, sounds like, okay, this is, career diplomat, speaking uh, in a lordly way about, other political uh, shifts in our government and their approach to the world at large. I mean, I think every administration comes in with some illusions
Hmm.
about what's going to work. And oftentimes they're influenced by things that they've put a lot of emphasis on for domestic political reasons or for domestic audiences. And then when they get tested out in the rest of the world, they're not always that successful and become less of an emphasis. And I think we could see that with this administration. But I think what is unique is the sort of unilateral disarmament aspect of the tools of public diplomacy that have served us well. I mean, I think you can point back at least to the late 30s when we first started to run real exchange programs, got the radios started in response to our concerns about Nazi penetration of South Africa. I mean, sorry, of South America. And so the apparent gutting of our foreign assistance, for instance, is a big deal in terms of public diplomacy. We weren't always that well coordinated with USAID, but the reputational security, to borrow Nick Cull's term, which is a good one, I think, that came from our efforts, humanitarian assistance, of public health work that we've done more recently. I mean, everything from Herbert Hoover's food assistance efforts in Europe uh, in the First World War and in the wake of the First World War, right up to PEPFAR and so forth. I mean, these had deep meaning for foreign publics and were remembered even, beyond a single generation. Um, so if we let that go, we're kind of losing the opportunity for I think one of the things that could stand to be the most compelling. It's worked for other countries for sure. Is a sort of public diplomacy of deeds. It's
Yeah.
not simply the blah blah online from 1 minute to another. Um, uh, Letting go the voice of America, the VOA brand. There are all kinds of things that could be done to shift VOA's emphasis. You could combine a number of the different broadcasters within Voice of America. Yes, there's the VOA charter, but there are ways of doing that. But to simply walk away from this strong brand, and this from an administration that understands branding,
Mm.
um, yeah, these things are kind of surprising, and I don't think they have a strong parallel or equivalent at least since the late 30s.
We saw an example of this in the last week, which is after the tragic earthquake in Myanmar. The U.S. wasn't really in a position to deliver aid the way that it normally would. And what do we see? We see some of our adversaries, notably China, jump into the breach. We're seeing that in a lot of different ways, including international broadcasting, the Chinese taking advantage of our weaknesses. And I was reminded this last week of with the earthquake story about the tsunami in Southeast Asia and Indonesia in 2004, and the way the United States, especially through the Defense Department in many ways, was able to deliver aid quickly. And this gets to an issue that I think sometimes is lost on not people on this call probably, but or in this webinar about the importance of public diplomacy and its relationship to national security. In 2004, this is post 9/11, you're talking about with Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world. The United States has a brand problem because of the war in Iraq. And this changed public opinion about the United States in Indonesia dramatically, almost overnight. And we're not able to do that sort of thing now. One of the things that I really enjoyed when I was lucky enough to work with you at IBDC was when you talk about throughout your career working with different administrations, different ambassadors. And one of the things you talked to me about a lot was the way in which a career diplomat such as yourself um, can find a successful one, a savvy one, finds ways to work within the sort of parameters set forth by an administration or in that administration's choice for ambassador at the embassy level. Um, what do you think a career person now can do to, not just, kind of slam on the brakes and put on a lot of, use a lot of bureaucratic tools to stall and that sort of thing, but I mean, kind of work within the parameters that this administration has set out. What would you do hypothetically, or what do you think a career person should be thinking about right now to work within this sort of system?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and I'm sure it is a question that a lot of the current practitioners are asking themselves, not just every day, but maybe every hour. And as they look around and see a lot of the tools that they would, typically come forward to meet new political appointees, folks who are setting the tone, setting the direction for things, say, okay, so here's some of the programs we have. Here are some of the things we could do with these. That's a real quandary. It's disorienting, I'm sure, to career people, along with obviously a lot of the other developments that we're following elsewhere in the government, for instance. So, but if you took, for instance, the dimension of exchanges, um, uh, to a degree that isn't even recognized necessarily by everybody in the public diplomacy family, exchanges are actually remarkably flexible, and they can be adapted for a lot of different directions and to respond to a lot of different narrative interests. And so, if you maintain the resources, which is one of the big questions in that area, there are ways of emphasizing other things entirely than what have been emphasized by prior administrations, even fairly abrupt terms. And, there are things that were emphasized during the first Trump administration, which could still be relevant, still be interesting, still be attractive to folks in the second Trump administration. And I think ECA, for instance, was quite responsive in terms of being able to support those initiatives. And, the First Lady, Ivanka Trump, for instance, were very involved in some programs in terms of women's entrepreneurship, of a number of other things which were very much responsive to the kinds of narratives that they were trying to further and the kinds of connections and diplomatic engagement that they were trying to foster. So I think that's the role of the career people, is to come forward and um, offer options and offer opportunities, put things in context. But of course, political leadership has to come in and have an element of trust and an element of respect and understanding for the experience and the knowledge that the career people represent. And that's a gap, obviously, that is hopefully going to be bridged, but has been rough sailing these first couple of months for sure.
One of the things you talked about earlier today and in your chapter is in the contemporary environment for the public diplomacy officer, um, one has to be dealing with communication in an environment that is completely different than most of what your chapter is talking about with this historical perspective, and specifically about the speed of communication with social media and other types of digital media platforms. Another aspect to that that we've discussed, especially last week's webinar, is the role of misinformation or even disinformation, or another term that's used a lot, malinformation, in those on those communication platforms. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship? Well, first of all, the practical nature of trying um, to maintain a sense of national credibility and strategic narrative in that kind of rapid environment when you're a diplomat whose career training is about making sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's crossed, and you're not creating a diplomatic incident by a misuse of a word here and there, which we've seen happen, of course, examples of that throughout history, not just in the social media age. But I'm wondering if you could talk about that for a second and also the unique challenges of that for public diplomacy and reputational security.
Yeah, I mean, as an older guy, I'm thinking of people in Joe's generation and some other people who are currently in the mix at the State Department and elsewhere doing public diplomacy work as being better equipped to understand how to counter some of these very serious challenges in terms of malinformation, disinformation, whatever label we want to put on it. Um, and that's been one of the things that a challenge that, leave aside this administration in the last couple of months, but that was a continuing challenge that we were maybe only meeting in part because of the nature of how we respond, the fact that almost inevitably what we were doing felt kind of reactionary. I think I had a critical word or two in my chapter about the Global Engagement Center, but in point of fact, I thought the Global Engagement Center was really starting to find its footing the last few years, and then unfortunately got caught up in a sense, a domestic political controversy over some of their grantees internationally and what they represented. But empowering other actors in other countries through grant support and otherwise to me seemed like a great way of approaching things rather than the early days of the GEC when it was counterpunching against Islamic extremists, message by message on one or another platform. Um, so I think this is one of the fundamental questions. And in an unsolicited testimonial to a different chapter in the book, for instance, I mean, I think that I learned a lot just from several of the other contributions that have been made in the PD handbook on this topic, because I know that a year ago when I was writing my contribution, that this was something for me, my generation, that really is a struggle. How do we get on this? But I'm thinking, for instance, about the piece that I think it's Eric Nisbet and a
Yeah.
colleague of his from Northwestern wrote. And, uh, you know, first of all, the taxonomy of the disinformation. How does it work? Identity grievance campaigns, information flooding, things that I had felt but couldn't quite categorize. And this is one of the values of the handbook for practitioners because I think it helps you conceptualize better what the challenges are in front of you. Um, but I did notice one of the things that was interesting to me was that the kinds of solutions, and they offer a number of ways of approaching this challenge of malinformation, deliberate disinformation, information operations against the United States and other partners of ours, the Russians being masterful at this, unfortunately. Um, uh, all of those solutions ultimately involved a kind of positive narrative or positive perspective, working together with people to promote media literacy, um, stressing shared identities and values. So even with this challenge, which is the challenge for this generation and the next generations, Joe, you included, I think it's still about finding positive common ground with like-minded people. Um, and so that hopefully is what um, uh, this new administration, which is seemed to be very much, sort of centered in its own intellectual and message space for the moment, can sort of see that it needs to spread its wings and have some coherent strategies vis-a-vis public diplomacy in support of their policy goals around the world. Um, but I
Well,
thought
there's
felt there are a number of things in the handbook that I recommend to people, including older people like myself, that are really useful and I think would be useful for practitioners themselves in terms of conceptualizing how they approach these questions.
Thanks for the plug. I appreciate it. Go buy
Sure,
the book.
sure.
Yeah, get your
Yeah.
library to buy the book. There is, I will say, I want to ask Joe for questions in a second, but I will say there's an alternative narrative there, though, or version of this, which is that the administration is looking at partners. It's just not the traditional partners, and that the people that they're interested in defending or allying with are Putin, Orban, or like in the last 24 hours, defending Marie Le Pen and people like that. So it may be just that they have a different idea of who our partners need to be, which is a scary thought in some ways. Joe, any questions from you or
Well,
webinar viewers?
I might hold fire and ask a question of my own towards the end because we have some really good ones in the Q&A box. Let me read one of these out to get us started. The first comes from from an old colleague and himself a former public diplomacy fellow at IPDGC, Carl Stoltz. Carl asked two questions. Uh, as someone who's worked in public diplomacy and other forms of diplomacy in Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe, um, can you suggest how posts might position themselves for the future in a very chaotic period of U.S. diplomacy? And then he asks, should we, for instance, adapt messaging to be less critical of Russia now, or continue to protest its abuses of free speech and international law? With that, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, hi, Carl. I think those are vital questions and questions that are probably even contributing to a lack of sleep for a few colleagues in the countries in question. And obviously, the answers should be different for Ukraine, for instance, and possibly for countries that are on the eastern flank of Europe, NATO partners, and so forth, than it would be in Russia. I think uh, certainly if the peace negotiations move forward, I think the administration ought to be open to efforts involving public diplomacy resources and the experience of people like Carl um, to find ways to build some bridges and develop some cooperation. Too far, too fast, that has some other implications, and how you balance the messaging of vis-a-vis our European partners, for instance. I mean, you'd have to be very careful about it. I do think, though, that obviously the kinds of things that we might emphasize are going to be different with this administration, and there's going to be less emphasis on, and they've, in fact, forced this change, less emphasis on things like diversity, of programs for tolerance. Maybe there's more emphasis on entrepreneurship, economic opportunity, cooperation in science and technology, which I always felt in general, long before this administration came around, was something that we didn't put enough emphasis in our public diplomacy efforts generally. So I think hopefully the professionals, including on the ground with the support of their front offices, can make some suggestions, demonstrate using the tools that they still have at least, for how they can reinforce what the administration wants to do in the public space. Specifically, what that's going to entail, Carl, you and I probably would both be simply guessing at this stage.
Joe? More?
A question from our esteemed colleague, Bruce Gregory. Mark, reflecting on your overseas assignments, could you talk about the extent to which public diplomacy was part of the activities of ambassadors, but also of USAID, military attaches, and embassy officers reporting to government departments other than the State Department? He's wondering, what are your thoughts going forward on mainstreamed public diplomacy in whole of government diplomacy?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, another great question, Bruce. If I had a hat to tip in your direction for everything that you've been contributing, I would. Um, I mean, I think, and you know this very well too, that it's evolved, it's changed. And I was just reflecting the other day on the fact that I still remember, even in the early 2000s, we joined the State Department from USIA, or we were joined. And there were still people, typically they were the traditional State Department officers who would say, yeah, we got this strategy we've developed here now. We ought to really add some PD at the end. We ought to tack it on, like, there's a little hammer here. Let's pin the tail on the donkey here before we send the donkey out into the world. Um, I'm happy to say that that has evolved considerably. And I think this is true to a greater or lesser degree with all the other foreign affairs agencies. I mean, there's some that obviously don't work in the public dimension anywhere near as much. But I think there's an understanding of this same basic principle that's grown over time, in part because, people have seen how the world has evolved, that you're going to have to, you know, speak to the public. You're going to have to bring people on board. You're going to have other stakeholders at play. And I went once or twice to what they call charm school, the ambassadorial training, just to speak on behalf of ECA. And I, used to say to the ambassadors in the, I don't know, 3 minutes that they would give us, you all are like late blooming public diplomacy officers, because what you're going to find as ambassadors and chiefs of mission is you're going to get out there in the field and you're going to find that, a big part of what you need to do is to be the public face and articulating why what we want to do, why our goals, whether they're bilateral or broader, bigger goals, are the right goals and that we're approaching them the right way. And so, somebody who may have spent their entire career even in consular work, by the time they get to that stage of their career, they're going to have to do the public diplomacy. And to use that example, consular work, I mean, I noticed over the years, increasingly, consul generals, other consular officers, sometimes the younger officers would understand, hey, we got to get the information out there. We got to engage people, get on the road, visit, other cities in the country that we're in to explain, not just what our regulations are, but, what's behind them and what we're trying to accomplish. So I think it has improved. It's not the let's tack some PD here on the end. It doesn't mean that there isn't room for improvement. The military and our political appointees, our non-career people, have often been among the people who've understood the best how important it is to get out there and engage public audiences.
Joe, another?
So I have a question about that in the box from a questioner who's looking at the integrity of professional exchanges like IVLP in this current moment. Long the integrity of the reputation of those programs is rested on freedom of speech principles and the balanced nature of programs that reflect a diversity of perspectives. The questioner notes those qualities are at risk with the tone the current administration is using, the scrutiny of social media profiles of visa applicants, the elimination of certain topics from discussion, and even the removal of certain resources or speakers who may be seen as too challenging of the
Right.
current administration. So the question the questioner is asking is how can practitioners continue to protect the integrity of programs like this, um, given that these values that are under pressure are a huge element of why they've been successful in the past?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And honestly, it demonstrates that the person behind the question has a lot of practical professional experience managing those programs. Uh, I think there are sort of two sides to this, and one is that I spoke already or referenced the fact that the exchange programs, and this would certainly be true for the IVLP, um, are inherently quite flexible. And, sort of at the editorial level, you can emphasize different things. You can bring people into contact with a visiting IVLP delegation, for instance, who are, going to be more likely to reflect the views of the administration, and that's fair. Um, Ultimately, though, the real argument for any new stakeholders, that new deputy assistant secretary, let's say, who's a non-career person who's come on board ECA learning about the programs and what they can do, um, uh, the credibility of what we're doing is vital. And this applies across the board to, any of the programs we've referenced already. If this is the argument that the practitioner needs to make and hopefully can help raise consciousness, make it successfully, at least up to a point, that if you're inviting people from country X, Y, and Z to come to the States and they have a sense they're just getting manipulated and they're only being exposed to one side of an argument, one side of a particular field of inquiry, they're going to know it. They're going to figure it out. And your money, your resources, your effort's going to be wasted. And they could conceivably come back not just, unpersuaded about, some of the messages and understandings that you want to further with them, but actually reacting negatively to it. So I think the question of credibility is at the heart of that, and it applies to exchanges. Um, It's been a big part of the success of our exchange programs, but also for the information programs as well. We really have to. I mean, there are different emphases editorially in a sense that you can make, and this would be true for VOA. This would be true for some of our online information programs, but you still have to be credible and truthful to the maximum extent possible. And I do fear that this could become a particular challenge or problem in the current environment.
This is an age-old tension and tug of war in the practice of public diplomacy in the political realm, which is how much, well, should this be propaganda or should it be something else? And when your brand is freedom, the thing that's always made our public diplomacy efforts successful to the extent that they were was when they reinforced that brand. That was why Radio Free Europe and Voice of America were successful during the Cold War. It's why exchange programs, as they've traditionally been practiced here and in other countries, have worked. But as we know throughout the history, including I mentioned at the outset, the event we did on the American exhibition in Moscow, the debates in Congress over what kind of art to show and what kind of messaging should be there, and people who then thought that it should just be propaganda, and didn't understand the value of presenting all sides as a way of demonstrating freedom. We ran into this in Iraq when with Radio Sawa and Al Hurra TV when sometimes they got more propagandistic and you lose the thread, you lose the narrative. It's really tragic. One of the things, we're almost out of time, and one of the things that we've managed to somehow do in these webinars so far is, despite everything, as people say these days, to try and end on a somewhat optimistic note as best but possible. So one of the things I want to ask then as we close is there's that saying, out of crisis opportunities. So we know what's happening, and there's no sense that there's going to be much of a let up. And if anything, it could, of course, get worse on the public diplomacy side, not to mention anything else. But I'm wondering what could come out of this. We talked last week, for instance, and the first week about possible ways in which this could open the door for reforms. And I've heard people make that argument about the Doge cuts, for instance, and things like that, just generally. From your perspective, whether it's what our allies might do to boost their public diplomacy and jump into the breach left by the United States, or whether it's within the United States context, things that might be positive ways to make some lemonade out of these lemons. What do you think about that?
Well, with the charge that I should be moderately optimistic, and I think there are potentially some opportunities, but it's hard to see
Yeah.
where those opportunities are going to be if you don't have resources and you don't have those tools available, or you don't develop something else that can fill the gap. But having said that, I think, there's some opportunities to do some things that might be involving public-private partnerships to a greater degree. Maybe what you're saying is, okay, we don't have a Voice of America, but we're going to find ways of incentivizing more of U.S. programming on different platforms. Maybe we find ways to actually, in places where it's value added, find ways of incentivizing foreign language versions of programming, for instance. There probably are some recipes out there that we didn't test because, in a sense, we didn't need to test them that maybe would be available to this new administration. I think the other thing that we have to hope for is just that there is a learning curve, and there has been for other administrations, that as they want to pursue their objectives, they're going to start feeling the need for these tools of diplomatic engagement. And they're going to start finding, gee, that next earthquake, for instance, where they really do want to demonstrate our support, and they find that we don't have the resources to do it. We don't have the mechanism to bring the Fairfax County emergency earthquake unit to country X, Y, or Z. And so, I mean, there may be some other ways of doing these things. I think the logic of trying to pursue your goals internationally in this global environment where you standing alone is just not going to cut it. You're going to have positive narratives about America, even if you want to emphasize military strength and economic strength. You've got to find some positive narratives to work with. And I think the logic of the situation will take hold eventually.
Well, from your lips, as they say. I want to thank Mark for joining us. I learned so much from him early in my career when we worked together. I had just taken over IPDGC, which was founded by our mutual friend, the late, wonderful Walter Roberts, who himself was a legend in international broadcasting, and worked with Kennan. You mentioned Kennan, worked with Kennan, and had wonderful stories to tell about him. Um, and as with the time we had together back then, Mark, this was illuminating and enjoyable. I want to remind everyone we have one more of these webinars related to the PD Handbook. It's going to be in a few weeks, though. It's on Tuesday, April 22nd at 11 a.m. Washington, D.C. time, when I'm going to talk to American University professor Kendra Salois about her chapter on hip hop music and cultural diplomacy. We'll see what's happened in between now and then. It's such an even, every day is another year. So we'll see. Thanks again to Joe and the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication for hosting this. Its current director, Babak Bahadur, Tarosio, and Damani, who helped put this together. And once again, Mark, thanks very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
All right. Take it easy,
Much.
everybody. See you in a couple weeks.